The eastern woods had a name in the old language. It meant the place where smoke lives. No one from the village went there. Not the hunters. Not the woodcutters. Not even the elder men who said they feared nothing. The trees were too tall, too dark, and too quiet. And everyone knew what lived inside. Lily knew all of this. She had heard the warnings since she was small enough to sit on her father's knee. Do not go east. Do not follow the smoke. Do not enter the trees where the ground is warm and the birds do not sing. But the little bird had a broken wing. She had seen it near the garden fence that morning, hopping in uneven circles, one wing dragging through the dirt. It was a small gray thing with a white chest, and it looked up at her with round black eyes that asked for help without making a sound. Lily had reached for it gently, the way her mother had taught her before her mother was gone. But the bird panicked and fluttered away in a low, crooked line. She followed it. She told herself she would stop at the old stone wall at the edge of the field. Then she told herself she would stop at the tall grass. Then at the first line of trees. And then the bird disappeared into the dark between the trunks, and without thinking, Lily stepped in after it. The forest swallowed her whole. It was not like the western woods where she sometimes picked berries with the other children. Those woods were bright and open and smelled like pine and wet earth. These trees were different. Their bark was black and their roots pushed up through the ground like old broken bones. The air was warm even though it was not a warm day. And everything was silent. No wind. No insects. No birds calling to each other from the branches. Lily walked slowly. She called out to the little bird in a soft voice. She pushed past low branches and stepped over thick roots. She told herself she was not afraid. But the light kept getting smaller behind her. By the time she stopped walking, she could not see the field anymore. She could not see the stone wall or the tall grass or the edge of the village. She turned around once, twice, 3 times. Every direction looked the same. Dark trees. Warm air. Silence. She sat down on a wide root and pressed her hands together in her lap. She did not cry. She thought of her father. Will would be home from the mill soon. He would call her name from the door. He would check the garden and the lane and the well. And then he would know. She hoped he would know which way she had gone. Far away at the village edge, Will was already running. He had come home early. Something had felt wrong the moment he turned the corner and saw the gate open and the garden empty. He called Lily's name once and the silence that came back made his chest go cold. He ran the lane. He checked the neighbors. He ran to the field and saw the tall grass bent where small feet had pushed through it. He stopped at the first trees. He stood there with his hands shaking and his breath coming hard. He could feel the heat coming from between the trunks. He could smell the strange warm smell that everyone in the village knew meant one thing. He could not go in. Not unarmed. Not alone. Not into those trees. He turned and ran back to the village shouting for help. Deep inside the forest, where the trees grew so thick that the sky was almost invisible, there was a nest. It had been there for many years. It was built into the side of a low rocky hill, half hidden by old roots and stone. The inside was lined with dry leaves and ash and the shed scales of the mother who had made it. And inside, curled together like a pile of warm river stones, 3 hatchlings slept. They were young. Their scales were still soft at the edges. Their wings were small and tucked tight against their backs. They made low sounds in their sleep, small rumbling sounds like a fire settling in a hearth. Sora came back through the trees in the late afternoon. She was large. Not the largest of her kind, but large enough that the branches bent when she passed and the ground pressed down under her weight. Her scales were deep gray with streaks of dark green along her neck and shoulders. Her eyes were gold and they missed nothing. She had been hunting far to the north and had eaten well. Now she wanted only to check on her young and rest. She came over the ridge and dropped low toward the nest, and then she stopped. Every muscle in her body went still. She lifted her head and pulled the air in slowly through her nose. She sorted through the smells one by one. Leaves. Her own young. Cold stone. Old wood. And then the other thing. It was faint. But it was there. Warm skin. Something living. Something that did not belong. Human. The word moved through her like cold water. Her claws pressed into the earth. Her wings came up slightly at her back. Her eyes swept the trees around the nest, sharp and fast, looking for movement, looking for iron, looking for fire. But there was no group of hunters. No torches. No traps set in the roots. There was only one small shape at the edge of the nest, tucked against her sleeping hatchlings, completely still. Sora moved closer, one slow step at a time. The shape was a child. A human child. Small hands. Small feet. Dark hair across her face. Fast asleep. Sora stood over the nest and looked down and did not move for a very long time. Sora did not move for a long time. She stood at the edge of the nest with her wings half raised and her eyes fixed on the small shape sleeping against her hatchlings. The child had not heard her come back. She was deep in sleep, her breathing slow and even, one cheek pressed against the warm scales of the smallest hatchling. Her small hand rested open on the ground beside her like she had simply fallen where she stood. Sora's first thought was danger. That was always the first thought when humans were near. Her mother had told her stories when she was young. Not stories meant to frighten but stories meant to teach. Humans came with iron blades and long ropes and fire that did not go out. They came in groups. They came quietly. And they took what they wanted and burned what they could not carry. Sora had never forgotten those stories. She had built her nest far from human paths because of them. And yet here was one. In her nest. Sleeping against her young. She circled slowly. Her feet were careful on the ground, each step placed without sound. She moved around the outside of the nest in a wide arc, her nose working the air the whole time. She was checking for others. For the smell of iron or smoke or torch oil. 4 boot prints in the earth that did not belong to this one child. For the sounds of men moving through trees. There was nothing. Only the child. Only the soft breathing of her hatchlings. Only the usual sounds of the deep forest settling into evening. Sora stopped in front of the nest and looked at the child again. She was young. Very young. Younger than Sora had first thought. Her clothes were simple. A plain dress, brown at the hem from walking through wet grass and mud. No weapon on her belt. No bag on her back. Her shoes were small and worn at the toe and one of her laces had come undone and trailed across the ground. She had not come here on purpose. That was clear. But clear or not, she was here. And she was pressed against Sora's young. And every lesson Sora had ever been taught said that was not something she could allow. She lowered her head close to the child and let a low growl build in her chest. It was not a loud sound. It was the kind of sound that moved through the ground before it moved through the air. The kind of sound that woke sleeping things slowly and made them aware before they were fully conscious that something large and dangerous was very close. The smallest hatchling stirred. Then the other 2. They blinked and looked up at their mother and she made a small clicking sound with her tongue that told them to be still and they obeyed, watching with sleepy golden eyes. The child stirred too. She came awake the way exhausted children do, slowly and in pieces. First her fingers moved. Then her shoulders. Then her eyes opened partway and she looked at the gray sky above the nest without understanding what she was seeing. She blinked. She turned her head. She saw Sora. For one moment the child was completely frozen. Her eyes went wide and her breath stopped and every part of her went stiff. Sora could see the fear move through her like a wave, instant and total. She could see the child's hands press flat against the ground, the muscles in her small legs going tight, the reflex to run waking up fast behind her eyes. Sora held very still and let the growl come again, low and steady, a warning that said do not. The child did not run. She stayed exactly where she was. Her chest was moving fast now, short quick breaths, and her eyes had not left Sora's face. But she did not scream. She did not scramble to her feet. She sat there on the ground of the nest with 3 hatchlings pressed warm against her sides and she looked up at the great dragon standing over her and she did not move. Sora had expected running. She had expected screaming. She had prepared herself for both. She did not know what to do with stillness. The seconds stretched long. Then the child opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was very small. Barely more than breath. But the forest was quiet enough that Sora heard every word. Sorry, she said. Sorry for sleeping in your home. Sora blinked. Of all the things a human had ever said near her, across all the years she had watched them from the treeline, across all the warnings her mother had given her, none of them had prepared her for that. 7 words. Spoken quietly. Without demand. Without bargaining. Without the sharp edge of fear turning itself into anger the way fear so often did in humans. Just sorry. And an acknowledgement that this place belonged to someone else. Sora pulled back slightly. Not far. But enough. She studied the child's face. The eyes were still wide but they were not wild. There was fear in them, yes, deep and real, but underneath the fear there was something else. Something careful. Something that was trying very hard to be respectful to a creature 10 times its size. The smallest hatchling made a soft sound and pressed its nose against the child's arm. The child looked down at it slowly, the way you look at something fragile that you do not want to startle. And then, so carefully that it barely counted as movement, she lifted one finger and rested it gently on the hatchling's snout. The hatchling closed its eyes. Sora watched this and did not speak and did not move. And the growl in her chest went quiet. The night passed slowly. Sora did not sleep. She settled at the entrance of the nest with her body curved around the outside edge and her eyes open and her ears tracking every sound the forest made. Twice she heard movement in the trees to the north. Once she heard the distant call of something large moving through the dark far to the west. She watched all of it and stayed where she was. The child slept through the night without waking. At some point in the deep dark hours the smallest hatchling had crawled fully into the child's lap. The other two had pressed in close on either side of her, their warm bodies rising and falling with slow breath. The child had pulled her knees up slightly in her sleep and wrapped both arms loosely around the smallest one without waking. She looked like she had slept this way 100 times before. Sora watched this and said nothing. She did not understand it. That was the honest truth of it. She had raised her hatchlings carefully. She had taught them wariness the way all dragon mothers did, slowly and with patience, letting them learn which smells meant safety and which meant danger. Human smell was supposed to mean danger. She had made that clear from the time they first opened their eyes. And yet here they were. All three of them. Pressed against a human child like she was warm stone on a cold night. She thought about waking them. About calling them to her side with the low clicking sound that meant come now. But each time she considered it she looked at their faces and saw how deeply they were resting and she did not make the sound. Morning came in thin and gray. The light moved through the tops of the trees first, pale and slow, turning the dark forest into something softer. Birds began somewhere far away. The air cooled slightly the way it always did just before full dawn. And with the morning came the others. Sora smelled them before she heard them. Old scale and wood smoke and the particular dry smell of dragons who had lived long enough that the forest itself seemed to be part of them. She lifted her head and looked toward the eastern trees and saw eyes watching from the shadow. Gold eyes. Green eyes. One pair that was almost white with age. They had come quietly. That was their way. The elder dragons of the deep forest did not announce themselves. They appeared, the way the dark appeared, all at once and from everywhere. Sora counted 4 of them standing in the trees. Watching. She held their gaze and did not move from the nest entrance. Her position was clear. She was not stepping aside. Whatever they thought of what they were seeing, she was not stepping aside. None of them came closer. They simply watched. Inside the nest the child stirred. She woke more easily this time, less confused than the night before. She sat up slowly and looked at the hatchlings around her and then looked at Sora and then looked at the gray morning sky above. She pressed her hands to her face and rubbed her eyes. Then she reached into the small pocket of her dress. She pulled out a piece of bread. It was not much. A short crust, the end of a loaf, slightly flat from being sat on through the night. She looked at it for a moment and then broke it carefully into 4 pieces. She looked at the pieces in her palm for a moment. Then she looked at the hatchlings. She held a piece out to the smallest one. The hatchling sniffed it, pulled back, sniffed again. Then took it from her palm with the very tip of its mouth, careful and precise, the way young dragons took food when they were being polite. Lily smiled. It was a small tired smile but it was real. She held out a piece to the second hatchling. Then the third. Each of them took it the same way, carefully, without grabbing, as if they understood without being told that this was something given freely and should be treated that way. The last piece Lily looked at for a moment. Then she placed it on the ground in front of Sora. Sora looked at the small crust of bread sitting on the earth between them. She did not eat it. She did not move toward it. But she looked at it for a long time. In the trees the elder dragons watched in silence. One of them, the oldest, the one with eyes that had gone nearly white, shifted his weight slowly. He had been alive long enough to remember things the others only knew as stories. He had seen the wars. He had seen the burning. He had watched nests go cold and dark because of what humans carried in their hands. He had never seen a human child offer the last piece of her food to a dragon. He watched the hatchlings move around the girl without hesitation, climbing over her legs, pressing their heads against her arm. The girl moved with them carefully, adjusting, making room, never grabbing or squeezing. She spoke to them in a low soft voice that carried no words he could understand but carried something else entirely. Sora watched her hatchlings and felt something shift inside her chest. She had seen them with other young dragons. She had seen them with the smaller forest creatures that sometimes wandered close. She had seen them with each other every day of their short lives. But she had never seen them like this. There was no testing. No circling. No small displays of uncertainty that young creatures always showed around strangers. They were simply calm. Completely and totally calm. As if the girl had always been there. As if she was just another warm thing in a world that was mostly cold. Sora did not have a word for what she felt in that moment. But something old and hard and long certain inside her became something else. And in the trees the elders watched and did not look away. Sora made the decision quietly. She did not think about it for long. She did not weigh it against the old teachings or measure it against what the elders would say. She simply looked at the child sitting in her nest with breadcrumbs on her dress and 3 hatchlings pressed against her sides, and she knew that the child needed to go home. And she knew the forest well enough to know that a small human girl alone in it would not last another night. She stood and stretched her wings once and folded them back. Then she made a low sound, not the warning growl from the night before but something shorter and softer. The hatchlings looked up at her. She clicked her tongue twice and they moved to the back of the nest and curled together obediently, watching with bright eyes. The child watched all of this. When Sora turned and looked at her directly, the child got slowly to her feet. She brushed the dirt from her dress with both hands. She looked at the hatchlings once more and said something soft to them. Then she looked at Sora and waited. Sora turned and walked. She moved at a pace the child could follow. That was a strange thing to think about, and she was aware of thinking it. She had never adjusted her pace for anything smaller than herself. But she kept her steps measured and her path straight, and she checked behind her every few moments to make sure the child was still there. Lily followed without being told twice. She walked close but not too close. She watched where Sora placed her feet and placed her own feet carefully in the same spaces where the ground had already been pressed flat. When Sora moved around a low branch, Lily ducked under it. When Sora stepped over a wide root, Lily climbed over it with both hands. She did not speak. She did not ask questions. She simply followed with the quiet attention of a child who understood that this was not the moment for words. The forest was different in the morning light. It was still dark between the trees and still warm in that strange way that had nothing to do with the sun. But the silence felt less heavy than it had the night before. Birds called from somewhere above. Once a small creature shot across the path ahead of them and vanished into the roots, and Lily turned her head to watch it go. Sora watched her watch it. There was something in the child that noticed things. Small things. The way light came through a gap in the branches. The color of moss on the north side of a trunk. She was not walking through the forest the way humans usually moved through it, which was fast and loud and desperate to be somewhere else. She was walking through it like she was reading it. Sora turned back to the path and kept walking. After a long while the air began to change. The warmth of the deep forest thinned. The trees spaced further apart. The ground underfoot went from black earth to pale dirt to the dry grass at the edge of the wild land. Light came in wider and brighter, and the smell of wood smoke reached them both. The village. Sora slowed as the trees thinned. She did not step out of the treeline. She stopped where the shadows still touched her and watched the open field ahead. Lily stepped forward and stopped too. She turned back and looked at Sora. There was something in her face that was not quite goodbye and not quite thank you, but lived in the space between the two. She pressed both hands flat against each other in front of her chest and bent her head forward slightly. A small gesture. A simple one. Then she turned and walked out into the field. She had not gone 20 steps when the shouting started. Will came out of the village at a run. He had not slept. That was clear from a distance. His face was pale and his eyes were red, and he had an axe in his right hand that he had clearly been carrying since the night before. Behind him came 3 other men from the village, and behind them women and children stopped at the edge of the lane to watch. Will crossed the field in seconds and dropped to his knees in front of Lily and grabbed her by the shoulders and held her at arm's length, looking at her face, her arms, her hands. He was checking her the way fathers check children when the fear has been too large to put into words. His mouth was moving but no sound was coming out. Then he looked up. He saw the treeline. He saw the shadow there that was too large and too still to be a tree. He saw the gold eyes catching the morning light from the darkness between the trunks. He stood up slowly and put Lily behind him with one arm and raised the axe with the other. His voice came out hard and flat. Get back. Lily stepped around his arm. She moved in front of him and turned to face him and put both her small hands against his chest. He tried to move her aside and she did not move. She brought me back, father, she said. She kept me safe all night and she brought me back. Will looked down at his daughter. Then he looked up at the treeline. His jaw was tight and his hand had not lowered the axe, and his breathing was the slow, careful breathing of a man holding himself very still on purpose. Behind him the village had gone completely quiet. No one spoke. No one moved. The children on the lane stood with wide eyes. The men beside Will had stopped where they were. Even the birds seemed to pause. Sora stood at the treeline and did not move and did not make a sound. She did not step forward. She did not raise her wings or show her teeth or do any of the things that would have made this easier to understand for the people standing across the field from her. She simply stood in the shadow of the trees and held the open ground between them with her stillness. And no arrow flew. And no axe swung. And the morning held its breath. Nobody moved for a long time. Will stood in the field with his axe still raised and his daughter's hands pressed flat against his chest. The men behind him had not stepped forward, but they had not stepped back either. They stood the way men stand when they do not know what the right thing to do is, but they know that doing the wrong thing could not be undone. Sora stayed at the treeline. She did not move toward them. She understood, in the way that old and careful creatures understand things, that the distance between them was not just the width of a field. It was something much older and much harder than that. She had felt it her whole life from the other side. The wariness, the readiness, the way the body prepares itself before the mind has finished thinking. She knew what that felt like. So she stayed where she was and she let the morning sit between them like a third thing. Then Will lowered the axe. It was slow. It was not easy. She could see it was not easy. His hand came down inch by inch and his eyes never left the treeline and his jaw stayed tight the whole time. But he lowered it. And when the head of the axe touched the ground, he put one hand on top of Lily's head and kept it there. Sora turned and walked back into the trees. She did not look back. She moved through the forest the way she always moved, quiet and certain, her feet knowing the ground without being told. But something inside her was different now and she could feel it with every step. Something had shifted in the night and the morning had confirmed it, and there was no returning to what she had been before she looked down into her nest and saw a sleeping child who had said sorry for being somewhere she did not belong. She went back to the nest. The hatchlings were awake and restless and pressed against her the moment she arrived. She settled low and let them climb over her and around her, and she stayed very still and let them do it. The oldest one nosed at her jaw. The smallest one crawled up onto her back and sat there making small sounds. She let it. After a while she raised her head and looked toward the east where she knew the elder dragons would be waiting. She went to them before midday. They were gathered in the old clearing, the one with the flat gray stones that had been used for meetings since before any of them could remember. 4 of them. Plus 2 more who had not been at the nest the night before but had heard and come. They sat in the particular stillness of creatures who have been thinking hard about something and have decided to wait for the one who knows before they speak. Sora stood in the center of the clearing and told them everything. She did not make it into something larger than it was. She did not add feeling to the parts that already had enough of it. She told it plainly the way it happened. The child in the nest. The bread broken into pieces. The hatchlings calm in a way she had never seen. The walk through the forest. The father with the axe. The daughter standing between them. She brought me back, father. Sora repeated those words exactly as she had heard them. She let them sit in the air of the clearing without explanation. The eldest dragon, the one with the white eyes, was quiet for a long time after she finished. He had been quiet for most of it. He had the habit of very old things, which was to listen completely before allowing himself to think. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and slow and carried the particular weight of something that has been held for many years. He said that he had lived long enough to believe that what had happened between dragons and humans was simply the nature of things. That it was fixed. That it could not be otherwise. He said he was old enough now to wonder if he had been wrong about that. Nobody argued with him. The meeting lasted until late afternoon. There were no loud voices and no striking of claws against stone and no fire shone. It was the quietest gathering any of them could remember. And when it ended, nothing dramatic had been declared. No treaty had been named. No boundary had been drawn on a map. But something had been agreed to in the way that true things are agreed to, without ceremony, without words that try to make the agreement feel important. Simply a recognition. That what had been seen could not be unseen. That a child had rested beside their young and nothing bad had come of it. That a father had lowered an axe. That was enough to begin with. Word moved the way word always moves among creatures who have lived in the same land for a long time. It went through the dragon clans first, carried on the wind and in the patterns of flight that dragons use to say things across long distances. Then it reached the villages slowly, the way strange and important news reaches small places, through one person who told another who told someone else who stood quietly in a doorway thinking about it for a long time before going inside. In Lily's village, the story became the kind of story that gets told at fires. Lily grew up and the hatchlings grew up, and the forest between the village and the deep eastern wood remained what it had always been, dark and warm and full of old things. But it felt different to the people who lived beside it. Not safe exactly. But not purely threatening either. Something in between that did not have a clean word. Each winter when the first frost came, a dragon appeared at dusk above the village. It circled once, twice, sometimes 3 times. High enough that it was only a shape against the gray sky, but low enough that the sound of its wings reached the lanes below. The children always heard it first and came running out to look up and point. It never landed. It never came close. It circled in the cold evening air above the small warm lights of the village, and then it turned and flew back toward the eastern trees and was gone. The elders said it was Sora. The young ones were not sure, and it did not matter to them. What mattered was that it came. Every year without fail, when the frost arrived and the nights grew long, it came. Not hunting. Just watching over the small ones below.